Right. Thank you for coming tonight. I want to continue the discussion that we were looking at the last few weeks. And I mentioned a quote that Menachem Kellner wrote in Must Did You Believe Anything, in which he says, the impact of Maimonides' position, that in short, Judaism has dogmas in the strictest sense of the word, was monumental and pervasive, while at the same time negligible. So we've seen in the last few weeks that it was somewhat negligible. Meaning we've seen a number of post-Maimonidean philosophers arguing against, taking issue with both the enumeration of Rambam's 13 Ikarim, the obligatory status of them, and also his view on accidental heresy, meaning his stringent view that even if somebody accidentally denies one of his Ikarim, he loses his chelek in Olam Haba. And so we saw in the last several weeks, after a 2-century kind of hiatus of this discussion, we saw this discussion erupting once again in late medieval Jewish philosophy. And we saw in this post-Maimonidean discussion of dogma, the Jewish philosophers of Duran, of Chassidei Kreskas, of Joseph Albo, all not only Jewish philosophers, but also rabbinic leaders, communal leaders, political leaders in their societies. And we see that all three of them took issue with Rambam's Yudgim U'Kleirim. All three of them deviated from his number of 13 principles, and all three of them also deviated and took a much more lenient view of accidental heresy, specifically taking shkaga, taking intentions and accidental, not a deliberate motivation to rebel into consideration when thinking about those who doubt or deny any of their ikarim. And so we see from each of those Jewish philosophers somewhat of a negligible Maimonidean influence. But I want to finish our discussion of late medieval Jewish philosophy by looking at two specific philosophers that really maintain and promote Rambam's influence, especially against those of Duran, Kreskas, and Albo who objected to it. And the first one that I want to mention is not a well-known Jewish philosopher, and also does not have a well-known system of dogma, primarily because it wasn't very innovative. But essentially, both of these, the first one, Abraham Bibago, and also then we'll spend a little bit more time on Isaac Abravanel, both of them are pro-Rambam, as opposed to the three that we mentioned in the last 3 weeks of classes. So Abraham Bibago died around 1489, so lived a little bit after Albo and Kreskas and Duran. But he also was not only a Jewish philosopher, but was also a rabbinic and communal leader in Huesca and then Zaragoza, Spain. And he wrote a work called Derech Emunah, or the Path of Faith. He published that around 1480. And he furthers Rambam's thoughts, deviates in slight ways, but argues, like Rambam, that human perfection depends on intellectual perfection via philosophical investigation and also via faith. So he says the path of faith, when coupled with philosophy, is superior to the path of philosophy alone. So he agrees with Rambam that human perfection achieved through intellectual means is the ultimate form of human perfection, is the ultimate end, the ultimate objective for humanity, but he adds that it could be achieved through faith as well. And in his Ikarim, he conceives of the principles, he conceives of Ikarim as beliefs, the rejection of which is tantamount to rejection of Torah as a whole. So for instance, belief in the existence of God, Rambam's first Ikar, Bibago argues, is a foundation on which all of religion rests, and therefore if it's denied, if it falls, the whole religion falls. So he agrees with Rambam's Yud Gimel Ikarim. Therefore, one could deduce that Bibago also believes that there are beliefs, the rejection of which are not tantamount to rejection of the Torah. So Bibago is not well known because he doesn't delineate a new system of dogma, but rather he divides Rambam's 13 Ikarim along the lines that we kind of discussed in light of Rambam's other references elsewhere in his philosophical works. So for instance, Bibago says here, and this is in Derech Emunah, you can see on my screen, he classifies the first part as negations. If you remember when we were discussing divine attributes according to Rambam, Rambam says with regard to the attributes of essence, one can't understand, humanity can't understand God's essence, but rather one needs to negate. This is what's called Maimonides' negative theology. One needs to negate that which God is not in order to come to some semblance of an understanding of what God is, because we can't understand God's essence, we can't understand God's existence, we can't understand God's knowledge, we can't understand God's form, and therefore, Vivago subdivides or further divides, advocates, defends, but further divides or perhaps explicates Rambam's Yud Gimel Ikarim by showing the negations that Rambam intended, but doesn't outright explicitly state in his Perush Mishnayot, perhaps because it would be beyond the comprehension of the masses for whom he was writing the Yud Gimel Ikarim. So Vivago, understanding the intentions, the philosophical intentions, being well versed in Rambam's other works in the Guide of the Perplexed, explains that the necessary beliefs, these obligatory beliefs, are the negation of non-existence. So God exists in some way, but just like you and I exist because we have beating hearts and we have, breath, God doesn't have such corporeal ways of existing, and therefore negating non-existence gives us some semblance of the proper conception of God's existence, which is Rambam's first ikar. Same thing with the second. Rambam's second ikar is divine unity, right? So Vivago understands what Rambam really means by that is that God is non-composite. So by negating multiplicity, one comes to an understanding of God in a non-composite, in a more accurate form, as opposed to believing in God's oneness, like I believe in my oneness, that I'm one body, although I'm composed of many different parts. That would not be true of God, because that would imply multiplicity to God, that would attribute multiplicity to God, and God's oneness is distinct from human oneness. We, again, just don't have the way to express that verbally in our language, and we don't have a way to conceive of that in our thought. Third, Maimonides' understanding of the third ikar was negation, was incorporeality, that God does not have a human form. And so what Vivago says is it's the negation of composition. We can't understand this esoteric, this ambiguous God's incorporeality. What is God? How can we conceive of God? But by understanding what God is not, we come to some better, more accurate understanding of what God is. So again, we negate the composite in order to think of God, conceptualize God in a non-composite, in a non-physical way. And then also D, the fourth ikar from Rambam, Vivago understands more accurately as the negation of coming to be, right? We talked about the idea of creation or the eternity of God, and what Rambam implied in his fourth ikar. He divides the next one as a second category, and that is fit actions of God's creatures, right? Rambam stated in his fifth ikar how one has to only worship God and one can't worship, even well-intended, any intermediaries for God. And so Vivago divides this as the second category. And in the third category, he puts the rest of Rambam's ikarim. He talks about God's actions in this third category and subdivides them into continuing actions, right? With regard to the living, God extends his providence over human individuals, as opposed to Aristotelian philosophers who say that God doesn't have providence over the individual, only over that which is unchangeable, the universals. And number two, on the dead, retribution, the idea that there is some final reward or punishment even after one is no longer alive. The completed actions affecting part of the world, namely prophecy and Mosaic prophecy, as well as that which affects all of the world, namely revelation on Har Sinai and the eternity and the immutability of the Torah. And then the last component, the last kind of subdivision, is the future actions upon the living, namely Mashiach, that God will bring Mashiach for ultimate salvation, and upon the dead, the Tchiyat Metim, the resurrection, corresponding with the 12th and the 13th of Rambam's Yud Gimel Ikarim. So Vivago is not innovating anything new. He is changing or kind of subdividing in different ways, but essentially defending all of Rambam's Yud Gimel Ikarim. And so we see that Vivago also agrees with Rambam, not just with regard to the explicit list of 13 and this being an exhaustive list, but he also agrees with Rambam and defends Rambam with regard to his conception of who is defined as a Jew, and thereby who is defined as a heretic if one denies any of these 13. If intentions matter, Vivago says, as he defends Rambam's strict position on accidental heresy, if intentions mattered, Vivago says, he extends the argument, then even the Christians would not be considered heretics. So he defends Rambam's Yud Gimel Karim as constituting all of the beliefs which ought to be counted as principles, as an exhaustive list of that which every Jew must believe in order to achieve human perfection, in order to merit immortality in Olam Haba, and in order to be able to have the intellectual preparation to survive in the intellectual plane of Olam Haba. So look at how he discusses his notion of accidental heresy, and he specifically addresses Ravid. If you remember from what we saw in the last paragraph of Rambam's Perush Mishnayot, after he delineates each of the Yud Gimel Karim, he says, if you are over, if you violate any of the laws, any of the halachot, you need to do tshuva. But if you violate, if you deny even one of these Yud Gimel Karim, you lose your chelik in Olam Haba, and you're not considered part of Klal Yisrael. And it doesn't seem to give any pass, any exception for somebody who accidentally came to a wrong belief, even if he was well-intended and, let's say, took the Torah literally and believed that God had an outstretched arm taking Bnei Israel out of Mitzrayim. And so Ravid objected in his commentary on the Mishnah Torah. We looked at this several weeks ago. Ravid, Rav Avram ben Zavid, objected to Rambam's very harsh, very strict stance with regard to accidental heretics, right? Just like one can be mistaken and repent for being over a halacha b'shogeg, one should similarly be able to repent and ameliorate his misconception with erroneous beliefs if he just stumbled into that belief inadvertently. And so Ravid says in his commentary on Rambam's Mishnah Torah, where Rambam takes that harsh stance, Ravid says, why has he, meaning Rambam, called such a person who took the Torah literally and thereby believed in God's corporeality, thereby denying the third of Rambam's Yud Gimel Karim? Why, Ravid argues, has Rambam called such a person a sectarian? There are many people greater than and superior to Rambam who adhere to such belief on the basis of that which have been seen in verses of scripture, and even more in the words of the Aggadot, which corrupt right opinion about religious matters. And we saw this idea from Ravid also supported by Mark Shapiro in his article. He talked about how the notion that God was corporeal, or the conception of God in corporeal terms, was commonplace, not just among the masses, but even among some sages. And therefore, one wouldn't rule all of these people, one wouldn't deem all of these people to be heretics, because these were prevalent conceptions in Rambam's day. And Ravid is not saying he necessarily believed in that himself, but he's defending the fact that this was a very pervasive belief and was an influential belief. And anybody who adhered to such a belief, because they took the Torah literally, because they took a God literally, they shouldn't be considered a heretic. They shouldn't be considered deprived of their chelik and olam haba, or be excluded from Klal Yisrael. Now look at Babago's response to Ravid. Both Babago, and we're going to see Abravanel as well, both respond specifically to Ravid's objection to Rambam. So Babago said, Ravid's statement is really amazing to me, since if it were correct, everyone who denied a principle without meaning to do so would have an excuse and a portion in the world to come. Even the belief of the Christians would not be inconsistent with true felicity, since they understood scripture literally, and they think that the intention of the verse is as they believe it. On this basis, they would not be called heretics and sectarians. It would be possible to find a man who does not believe in any one of the principles or beliefs of the Torah because of his failure to understand the meaning of the Torah. On this position, such a one could be called neither sectarian nor a heretic. All this opposes reason and faith. So he says, if you go down this road, it's a slippery slope. Then you would say, nobody is a heretic, because everybody would just say, I mistakenly came to this wrong opinion, and therefore I have this total misconception, this total erroneous belief about God. And he says, it can't be. There has to be some fine line. There has to be some clear delineation of what could and cannot be believed. And therefore, this is the line. He defends Rambam's Yud Gimel Karim as the line. This is how you have to believe in. He goes so far to explicate what Rambam really intended in the 13 Karim by kind of incorporating into Rambam's Yud Gimel Karim some of the Aristotelian influence that Rambam really intended, but didn't necessarily state explicitly for his kind of intellectually ignorant masses that he was addressing in his Perush Mishnayot. And that's why he wrote it specifically there to correct, even on a kind of a preliminary level, even on kind of a basic level, to correct the wrong beliefs of the masses so that they would have kind of the bare minimal proper conceptions of God in order to worship him properly. So the Bhagavad at the end of his work raises an objection. He says, if the Torah is immutable, as Rambam asserts in his 9th Ikar, that the Torah is unchanging, that it can't be replaced, it can't be supplanted again, and he was writing this against, the Christians and the Muslims' claim of the New Testament and of the Quran. The Bhagavad raises the objection: if the Torah is in fact immutable, as Rambam states in the 9th Ikar, how can Mashiach and Tchiyat Mitim be principles that the Torah rests on, since once they come, it's no longer going to be necessary to believe in their coming? And Vivago resolves the objection at the very end of his book by saying that the principles to believe in both of these experiences, both in the experience of Bibiat Mashiach and also in Tchiyat Mitim, these are independent of time. And so one needs to maintain this, but Maimonides just phrased it in terms of the future coming in order to refute the Christian claims that the Messiah had already come. That was one of the attacks of Christianity, again, later in the disputations that we talked about with regard to Albo last week. And so one still needs to believe in the idea of Mashiach, the idea of Tchiyat Mitim as a principle of the Torah, and not just the future coming of it. That was just based on the context in which Rambam was writing. Now, Vivago influenced Isaac Abravanel, although Abravanel does, and we see this because some of the language is almost identical, and we'll see that in a minute to how Vivago wrote, but Abravanel does not attribute any of his writings explicitly to Vivago. And because Abravanel felt that Vivago was not successful enough in his defense of Rambam. So Abravanel once again takes up the mantle of Vivago in defending Rambam and trying to make Rambam's Yod-Gimel Karim an authoritative and a uniform, to have a uniform acceptance amongst Bnei Israel. And even though that was Vivago's mission, Abravanel furthers it in a much more sophisticated way without attributing anything to his influence, Vivago, because he felt Vivago was unsuccessful in achieving this goal. Now, Isaac Abravanel was the last of the medieval Jewish philosophers to deal with this topic of dogma. He lived in 1437 to 1508. So this is the post-expulsion from Spain period. And so after such a historical catastrophe as the expulsion, Abravanel sought to encourage and console the shattered Jews and establish Rambam's dogma as a normative system. So just like we saw that there was kind of a 200-year period where there was like a lull in the discussion of dogma, we see the resurgence of the discussion during the persecution and during the tumultuous times in late medieval Jewish history, starting in the late 14th century throughout the 15th century. And Abravanel is the last one, again, still during this very hostile period following the expulsion. He's still the one serving as not only a Jewish philosopher, but also as a communal leader and feeling this need based on his historical context, based on his community, feeling the need to provide the Jews that were so confused over what they believed. He wanted to provide them with a normative system. And he writes the book called Rosh Amanah, and he begins with a Hebrew translation of Maimonides' 13 Karim to make it accessible to the Jews of his generation that were no longer well-versed in Arabic from Rambam's generation. And he devotes the majority of his work, the majority of the chapters in Rosh Amanah, he devotes to defending Rambam's Yod-Gimel Karim and addressing the explicit objections of Kreskas and Albo to Rambam's Yod-Gimel Karim. We talked about 2 classes ago in last class how Kreskas and then Albo took issue with the number of the Karim, the obligatory status of the Karim, the position and accidental heresy from Rambam. And so Abravanel takes upon himself to not only explicate and defend Rambam's Yod-Gimel Karim, but also to address, to resolve, to counteract the objections of Kreskas and Albo, who criticized Rambam's Yod-Gimel Karim. So that's the majority of his work. It's 22 chapters of his work. But in the second to last chapter of Rosh Hashanah, in chapter 23, he entitles the chapter An Explanation of What I Consider to Be the Correct Opinion on This Matter. And in this chapter, he objects to Kreskas and Albo's attempts to delineate dogma, but he also seems to contradict his whole defense of Rambam, right? He just spent the last 22 chapters defending Rambam's Yud Gimel Ikarim, and then we see in this chapter, chapter 23, he seems to totally contradict himself. So look what he says here. Rosh Hashanah, chapter 23, Abravanel. Our scholars, having been dispersed among the nations and having studied their books and sciences, learned from their deeds and copied their ways and customs with respect to the divine Torah. They said, how do these Gentiles pursue their sciences? By positing first principles and roots upon which a science is based. I will do so also and postulate principles and foundations for the divine Torah. It's not proper to postulate principles for the divine Torah, nor foundations in the matters of belief, for we are obliged to believe everything that's written in the Torah. We are not permitted to doubt even the smallest thing in it, that it should be necessary to establish its truth with those principles and roots. For he who denies or doubts a belief or narrative of the Torah, be it small or great, is a sectarian and an apikoros. For since the Torah is true, no belief or narrative in it has any advantage over any other. So we see Abravanel kind of doing a 180. He had just defended in the first 22 chapters the 13 Ikarim and trying to make that a normative system of dogma for his generation. And then we see him arguing against Kreskas and Albo for using the same kind of postulates of science, premises of science to present a hierarchy with principles and roots like science is based on, to present that for theology. But then he seems to refute Rambam's entire delineation, right? Rambam says there's clearly an explicit, exhaustive list of 13 obligatory beliefs. And Abravanel says, it's not proper to postulate principles for the divine Torah. We're obliged to believe everything that's written in the Torah. We're not permitted to doubt even the smallest thing. And he says, anyone who denies or doubts a belief or a narrative in the Torah, be it small or great, is a sectarian and apikoros, right? Because the whole Torah is true, no belief or narrative in it has any advantage over any other. It seems that Rambam's doing the opposite. Rambam is saying, no, these 13 have an advantage over the other. These 13 are the ones that are actually obligatory. So how do you understand what Abravanel is doing? He just spent the last 22 chapters defending Rambam's exhaustive, explicit list of 13 Ikarim. And now here in the 23rd chapter, he's saying, yep, everything in the Torah you need to believe is true. And anybody who denies anything, a belief, a narrative, anything small or great is an apikoros. And because the whole Torah is true, no belief or narrative in it should be superior or considered more obligatory than anything else. So how do you reconcile that seeming contradiction in Abravanel's work? What is Abravanel's true opinion? Is it that he actually agrees with Rambam, and these are 13 Ikarim that are obligatory, and if you deny any of them, you lose your chelek on olam haba, and this is an exhaustive list. This is actually what's obligated, and the rest are not necessarily. Or how do you understand? Do you take at face value if he's saying everything in the Torah you need to believe is true, and therefore there's not any single thing, belief, commands, narrative that's more obligatory than the other? Any ideas?
The Jewish answer is that it's both true. They're both true.
Yeah. How do you understand that?
So I understand him to be focusing on the written and the oral Torah, but not so much philosophy. So he could maybe be both saying the Rambam principles are correct, but everything in the Torah is correct, and you have to believe that.
So where would you think his stance would be on accidental heresy?
Well, it could be the stance that you explain, which could be, well, he's not really critical necessarily of accidental heresy, but rather to really understand God, you have to really work on your intellect. And otherwise you can't really understand it and can't really get into Olam Haba. So it's really, you have to push yourself to learn, otherwise you're not going to get this benefit, rather than you have sinned and therefore
More motivational, you're saying?
Yeah.
So you're saying that was Rambam's intention, or that's Abravanel's intention?
I'm saying, well, that was Rambam's intention, so that, you know, maybe the whole accidental heresy thing is, it sounds worse than it is if you look at it as where you haven't applied yourself enough to the intellect, so therefore you're not going to benefit from Olam Haba.
Yaakov, what would you like to add?
Right, so maybe according to Barbanel, Rambam's 13 principles are less about, you know, these are the most important Jewish principles, and more about trying to address specific challenges from Christians, Muslims, Aristotelians. And then, sure, he had a list of these 13 principles. Here's how we're different. You know, Messiah hasn't come yet, so we're different than Christian, et cetera, et cetera. But then, given that, you know, from the actual Jewish perspective, all beliefs in the Torah are equally important and valid, and denying any one of them makes you a heretic.
So we mentioned when we were discussing Rambam's Yugim Likarim, we mentioned a bunch of different motivations of what perhaps Rambam really meant. Was this an exhaustive list? Or these just general categories representing more? Was this more of a pedagogical tool? Was this based on his historical context, kind of like the intention to allow the conversos to understand that really you can still be considered a Jew if you maintain the proper conceptions, and not even if you kind of have abandoned your physical practice of the halachot. So we mentioned a bunch of different interpretations or suggestions or theories as to what really motivated Rambam to write the Yud Gimel Karim, and what did he really mean by these Yud Gimel Karim? Were these really just an exhaustive, exclusive list, or did it really represent just larger categories of other things as well? So Abravanel seems to only defend Rambam's formulation of the Yud Gimel Karim against Kreskas's and Albo's objections as a pedagogical device for the ignorant masses, but not as an exhaustive list of obligatory beliefs. So he doesn't deny that certain beliefs must be held in order to merit salvation or Olam Haba, but he elevates every belief to the status of necessary dogma. So unlike Rambam, who believes that these 13 are sufficient for attaining salvation, he extends it to really everything in the Torah. Look at how he states it further along in the same chapter of Rosh Hashanah. He says here, with regard to beliefs, we may say that he, Maimonides, did not choose principles among them in order to say that we are obliged to believe these principles, but no others. His intention was rather correctly to guide those men who did not delve deeply in the Torah, since they could not comprehend or conceive of all of the beliefs and sciences which are included in the divine Torah. Maimonides chose 13 most general beliefs to teach them briefly those matters in such a way that all men, even the ignorant, could become perfected through their acceptance. So we saw a quote from J.D. Bleich a couple of sessions ago, or when we were finishing our discussion of Rambam, where he says this is just kind of the bare minimum of the intellectual prerequisites that were necessary for Olam Haba. And therefore, Abravanel is defending Rambam, but he's saying that Rambam's Yud Gimel Karim are not an exhaustive list. This is kind of the bare minimum, but really one is obligated to believe in the whole Torah. It's just that not every Jew would necessarily have the intellectual preparation or perhaps the stamina to really understand and delve deeply into all of the Yud Gimel, all of the Torah, all of the specifics in the Torah. And therefore, these 13 give the kind of basic bare minimum understanding in order to achieve the necessary level, even if it's not the ultimate level, but the necessary level of human perfection or intellectual preparation to be able to survive in Olam Haba. So Abravanel explains Rambam's intention and why he included his 13 specifically in the Perush Mishnayot as opposed to in the guide, right? This was intended for the masses, for these ignorant who wouldn't, the ignorant masses or those who are not necessarily philosophically prepared, who wouldn't be able to delve deeply into the entire Torah. But he explains that Kreskas and Albo took Rambam too literally, and they found a need to adjust Rambam's 13 Ikarim with their own hierarchical systems of dogma. But Abravanel argues that Kreskas and Duran are mistaken because all beliefs are true, and some are not principles or foundations over others. There's not this kind of hierarchical status, there's not this kind of hierarchical system, but rather all are principles upon which the Torah is based. And if one denies or contradicts any one of them, even the smallest, it's as if he has said that the Torah is not from heaven. And so Abravanel, further in this chapter and in the next one as well, talks about different theories. If there were principles, it would have been appropriate that they be included in the Decalogue, in the Aseret Dibrot for all of the Jews to hear. And we see of Rambam to Gimel Ikarim, only one or two are included. And he argues if there were principles, if there were in fact Ikarim, an exhaustive list, they would have been mentioned at the beginning of the Torah, just as the axioms of science are at the beginning of scientific proofs upon which the rest of the theory is built. But Rambam to Gimel Ikarim were not mentioned at the beginning, and does not even, Rambam doesn't even include creation as one of his 13. And he argues also if there were actual Ikarim, if there were actual explicit principles, it would be proper that punishment for denial of them would be graver than punishment for denying other beliefs. And we don't see that being the case. The punishment for denying the lightest commandments seem to be the same as punishment for the harshest. And so he says that the point of the Mishnah that Rambam interprets to explain the Gimel Ikarim, right? Rambam, he puts the Gimel Ikarim as an explanation of the three kind of categories in the Mishnah and Sanhedrin. Abravanel says the point of the Mishnah is not to lay down those principles, but rather to emphasize that all Jews have a share in the world to come, which can be merited through the fulfillment of even one mitzvah. So there's no specific principles beyond the general acceptance of the Torah, but it's possible to lose one's share in Olam Haba. And those are the three beliefs that are enumerated in the Mishnah. Those are three examples of heresy which would restrain someone from Olam Haba, all being related to denial of Torah in some sort. So one could deny the Torah for three reasons: because of a lack of belief in the giver, meaning in Apikoros, a lack of belief in the Torah itself, namely denial of Torah Mina Shamayim, or because of the nature of the recipient, denial of resurrection. So we see that the point of the Mishnah, and in general, we don't see Chazal delineating any explicit propositions or any explicit principles, because according to Abravanel, all of the principles are of the same status. Every belief in the Torah, every commandment in the Torah, every narrative in the Torah has equal status, and all must be believed in order to be defined as a Jew, in order to merit a chelek in Olam Haba. Now, Abravanel also argues that philosophical speculation was dangerous, because mistakes can cost an individual a share in Olam Haba, just like as explicated in those three categories in the Mishnah. And so Abravanel's motivation was really to help the Jewish masses cope with the uncertainties that were raised during his time period with the expulsion in 1492. And therefore, he takes a harsh stance, like Rambam, with regard to accidental heresy, because he says there's no room for any denial of any belief of the Torah. So like Duran, Abravanel does agree with Duran, who we saw ultimately after he kind of divides Rambam to Gimel Ikarim into three categories. We see ultimately Duran says, but there's really only one principle of the Torah, to accept all the teachings of the Torah. So he does, Abravanel says the same idea. He agrees with Duran with respect to that there's really one principle of the Torah, that you have to believe in absolutely everything of the Torah. But he sharply disagrees with Duran with regard to accidental heresy. If you remember, when we looked at Duran, and it was kind of furthered by both Kreskas and Albo, they took Shkaga into consideration. They said that if one denies, if one comes to an erroneous understanding, a misconception, but they were well intended, he says, Duran says, and it's also echoed in Kreskas and Albo, Duran says that one is not a heretic. One does not lose their chelek in Olam Haba, because just like with regard to halacha, we take shkaga into consideration, so too with belief. So if one was well intended but took the Torah literally and therefore came to a conception of God in corporeal terms, One needs to rectify his wrong belief, but one is not considered a heretic. But we see that even though Abravanel agrees with Duran with regard to this idea that there's really only one principle of the Torah to accept all of the Torah's teachings, Abravanel sharply rejects Duran's stance on accidental heresy, and instead furthers the idea of in the stricter sense of Rambam, of a Bibago, and he rejects, similar to Bibago, Ravid's position. Again, if you remember, Ravid is the one that called out Rambam and said, I don't understand. There are many people greater than you, Rambam, that take the Torah literally and accept or conceive of God in corporeal terms. But look at how Abravanel, again, just like Bibago before him, rejects Ravid's approach in defense of Rambam's stricter stance. Abravanel says, according to it, meaning Ravid's view, that kind of condones the belief in God's corporeality, one who unintentionally denies every principle will acquire a portion in the world to come. It would be possible, according to this, to find a man who does not believe in any one of the principles of or beliefs of the Torah, and yet who should not be called a sectarian or a heretic if he were brought to this blind foolishness by his failure to understand the meaning of the Torah. These things are intolerable according to both the faith of the Torah and correct reason. For a false doctrine about any one of the principles of faith turns the soul from its true felicity and will not bring one to life in the world to come, even if the opinion is held without intention to rebel. It's like poison which consumes the spirit of him who eats it, even if he ate it thinking that it was good and healthy food. Similarly, heresy and false belief in the matter of principles of religion will expel the soul of man and without a doubt make it impossible for him to inherit the world to come. So Abravanel is furthering the idea against Ravid, furthering the idea of Rambam, furthering the idea of Bibago, that one has to have proper beliefs in God. One has to have proper conceptions of that which is taught in the Torah, because without proper conceptions, one can't achieve human perfection. And just like if you drink something thinking it's healthy, but it ends up being poison, you didn't realize, you certainly didn't intend, it will still have the same destructive effect on your body. So too, if you inadvertently come to a wrong conception, it will still have the same spiritual corruption, even if you didn't adopt such a belief intentionally. And therefore, Abravanel takes the same hard line with regard to accidental heresy as Bibago and Rambam before him. So it's possible that Abravanel held this kind of more stringent view regarding accidental heresy because of his times. And we've seen the historical context kind of influencing many of the late medieval Jewish philosophers and their philosophical stances. Perhaps he was thinking that there's no room in this period where there's a lot of confusion, theological confusion amongst his expelled co-religionists. Perhaps he felt that there was no room for internal division. So therefore he didn't permit any sort of deviations from one universal norm. So Abravanel wrote the Rosh Hashanah. He kind of took it upon himself to write this whole work to allay the doubts of the Jews that were confused by all of the competing dogmas of the other medieval Jewish philosophers who preceded him, and also to kind of undermine the dangers of philosophy by elevating every belief in Judaism to the status of dogma. If he made obligatory every belief in the Torah, then all of the Jews in his generation would have a uniform understanding and belief and ability to unite together despite the confusion amongst them, especially that which was heightened by the persecution that they experienced prior to their expulsion. We can see that the debate over dogma in general, over who is considered or defined as a Jew, over accidental heresy, it really reflected different opinions with regard to Jewish theology, right? Is a Jew one who believes in specific principles of the Torah, or is it one who believes that everything included in the Torah is true? And once one accepts the Torah in general, innocent deviations can either be considered mistakes, or it could be considered that which excludes one from olam haba, and from the ability to achieve human perfection and thereby immortal communion with God. So it brings us back to the distinction that we made between the rabbinic conceptions versus the more earlier medieval conceptions, right? The difference between the belief in versus the belief that theologies. We talked about the belief in theologies. We talked about the distinction made by Martin Buber originally, the distinction between belief in theologies, the trust in God, belief in God's Torah, versus the belief that theology, the more intellectual propositions that one believes to be true about God. And so we see with the delineation starting by Rambam, this shift from the belief in theology to belief that theology. And then we saw in the late medieval period some reversion back to the belief in type of theology, especially with regard to some of the views on accidental heresy, where what mattered was really one's intentions, even if one came to erroneous conceptions about God. Now, just like in the 2 centuries after Rambam, where there was little discussion of dogma until the persecutions, which really began in 1391 and continued through the expulsion, we saw there was little discussion because that wasn't on the forefront of the philosophers' minds. But when the Jewish community started to undergo persecution and they needed to have the ability to defend themselves in uniform ways, that motivated the Jewish philosophers at the time, who were also religious and communal leaders, and motivated them to set out a uniform defense of Judaism so that their co-religionists could defend themselves and their theology in the face of Christian attacks. And so similarly, after the expulsion in 1492, after Abravanel, the discussion of dogma again died out. And the attention to cognitive propositions also made sense in a context that was more influenced by Greek philosophy. And so after the 15th century, there was a far less philosophical influence on the Jews, which also contributed to the lack of this discussion among Jewish philosophers and within Jewish communities. So if we go back to the questions that we started our whole discussion of Jewish dogma with, we started by asking, are we obligated exclusively in our actions, or are there obligatory beliefs as well? And we've seen now, as we conclude the medieval period, a debate about this question in general. Are we obligated exclusively in our actions? Probably not. But if we're obligated also in our beliefs, there was a lot of debate over what beliefs were actually obligatory. So many of the Jewish philosophers believed, yes, we are obligated in our beliefs, but we see a tremendous disparity with regard to which beliefs. So Rambam would say those 13. Duran established 3 categories of Rambam's 13, but then says essentially you're just obligated to believe in God's Torah. We see Kreskas has a 4-tiered hierarchy with 6 pinot. We see Yosef Albo having 3 ikarim, which is basically condensing Rambam's Yud Gimel Ikarim, but then we see him having Shorashim and Anafim derived from it. And then we see Abravanel defending Rambam's 13, but basically saying essentially you only need to believe in one, and that's that all of the Torah is true, elevating everything to the status of obligatory dogma. And so we see with regard to question number 3, are they universally accepted? Unfortunately not. And each of the Jewish philosophers that felt the need to delineate their own system or to explicate Rambam's or to deviate from Rambam's, they all saw that because there was not universal acceptance, there was a need to create their own system in an accessible way to allow all of the Jews who were confused and who were being coerced to convert to other religions. It was they felt the need, these Jewish philosophers that were also communal and rabbinic leaders, they felt the need to delineate and publicize one uniform and accessible system of dogma so that they could defend themselves against their attackers. So we saw in 4 and 5, if such beliefs have obligatory status and are denied, is one punished? All of them would say yes. If it was deliberate denial, you would be punished. But they deviated tremendously with regard to the 5th question. If you're well-intended but holds a mistaken conception of an obligatory belief, would you be considered a heretic? So we saw today the furthering of Rambam's more harsh stance, or maybe you can say it's just a consequence, where you need to believe in 113 Ikarim, And if one doesn't, as a consequence, you lose your chelik in Olam Haba because you're not intellectually prepared for it, the intellectual state of Olam Haba. We saw that in Babalgo's argument, as well as in Abravanel's analogy to the poison. However, we see a lot of people, like the post-Rambam, Duran, Kreskas, and Albo, says no, just like in Halacha, we take intentions and accidental motivations into consideration. So too, we should also do that with belief. Everybody agrees that one must correct erroneous beliefs or misconceptions. One needs to do tshuva, just like one needs to do tshuva when they're accidentally violating a halacha, but one shouldn't be excluded from Olam Haba if they didn't mean to rebel. And one shouldn't be excluded from being part of Klal Yisrael. So what I want to just turn our attention to for the last couple of minutes is the three questions that I want to transition into the modern period. Based on our understanding of kind of the ebbs and flows of the discussion of dogma in the medieval period, starting with the biblical and rabbinic time, where there wasn't really a need to explicate or to systematize dogma because of God's palpability, the presence of God that was palpable for the biblical and the rabbinic Jewish communities. And then we saw the need in Rambam's time, and then we see another lull for a couple of hundred years, and then we see the need rise up again to discuss dogma in the late medieval period. Why do you think, why is the topic of dogma virtually no longer discussed? What is the modern conception of dogma? And how, in your conception, when you think about obligatory beliefs, how has it changed since the medieval era? Any thoughts of this? As we start to discuss next week, the modern conception of dogma, there was a book published in 1999 by Menachem Kellner, Must a Jew Believe Anything? He made a pretty bold claim, and that erupted a lot of responses, book reviews, some pretty harsh objections, and that motivated him to write an afterword when the second edition was published, where he kind of clarified his views a little bit. But we don't see a tremendous discussion either in the academic circles or in more popular circles. We don't see a tremendous discussion over dogma. And one would argue, if we see a lot of discussion over halacha, why is this? And this is what Bachi and Kapuzi argued with the first source that we started our whole discussion with, right? Why is that neglected? Why isn't that important? Why isn't that being discussed? So what's your impression? Thinking about the Jewish community today, thinking about the emphasis perhaps on halacha or other social issues, why is the topic of dogma virtually no longer discussed in our day? What's the modern conception of dogma in your mind? And how has your conception of dogma today, the contemporary conception, changed from the medieval discussion that we've discussed in the last several weeks? Any ideas? Food for thought? I'll let you mull it over the next week. Think about how the medieval discussion that we've been discussing has influenced your conceptions today of dogma. Which of the systems have you found compelling? Which of the systems do you not find particularly sound? And then we will look at Kellner's discussion, the modern discussion that he published 20 years ago next week, as well as a lot of the contemporary responses to it. And you can see where you would weigh in on this debate, how you would respond to Kellner, or if you find his approach particularly persuasive. I'll leave it there for tonight. Have a good night, and I hope to see you next week.
Thank you.
Bye.